The notice came in a white envelope with a federal return address in the upper left corner, and it was 3 pages long. And the key line was on page 1, paragraph 4. In language that was not designed to be cruel, but accomplished cruelty efficiently nonetheless. It said, based on the findings of the inspection conducted on April 3, 2014, and the facility's failure to meet Grade A compliance standards under 7 CFR. Part 58. The above-referenced operation is hereby prohibited from marketing fluid milk under federal order, effective 30 days from the date of this notice. Nora Jean Halverson read that line at her kitchen table at 6:14 in the morning, before the first milking of the day, with a cup of coffee she did not finish. Then she put the notice on the table and went out to the barn. The Halverson Dairy sat at the end of a gravel road in Dunn County, Wisconsin, 8 miles from the nearest incorporated town, on 220 acres that Nora's father, Clarence Halverson, had farmed from 1961 until 1992. When his knees gave out in the way that knees give out on men who have spent 31 years walking concrete barn floors. And he handed the operation to Nora the way you hand someone something you have been carrying for a long time, with relief and with the understanding that they know the weight of it. He had told her one thing. He said, "The herd is the farm, everything else is infrastructure." Nora had been 43 years old when she took it over. She had worked beside her father since she was old enough to carry a milk pail, had gone away for 2 years to study agriculture at the University of Wisconsin in River Falls, and had come back not because she felt she had to, but because she understood, having been away, what she would be giving up if she didn't. She was a dairy farmer the way some people are musicians, not because it was the best available option, but because it was the only one that made sense. She had run the operation for 22 years by the time that envelope arrived. 64 Holstein cows, or Holstein, a Grade A milking parlor her father had built in 1981, and that she had updated twice, in 1999 and in 2009. A bulk tank certified at 1,200 gallons. A milk hauling contract with a cooperative in Menomonee that picked up every other day and had done so without interruption since 1985. The farm produced an average of 20,400 pounds of milk per month. At the Class 3 blend price in early 2014, that was approximately $500 per month in gross milk receipts before input costs. It was not a large operation by modern standards. It was a functioning one. The inspection had been conducted on a Thursday morning in early April by a USDA dairy grader named Justin Kerr, who was 31 years old and had been assigned to the Dunn County District 14 months earlier after completing his grading certification in Madison. Kerr was not a bad inspector. He was a thorough one, which in this case amounted to the same outcome. He had found 3 deficiencies in the milking parlor: a crack in the parlor floor along the east drain line that exceeded the permissible width under 7 CFR Part 58, a gap in the overhead lighting fixture covers that allowed potential particulate contamination, and a cooling rate for the bulk tank that had, on the test date, taken 47 minutes to reach 40 degrees Fahrenheit rather than the required 30 minutes. A variance Nora attributed to a compressor running 3 degrees warm that she had already scheduled for service. Each deficiency was real. Each was documented. The report was accurate. The notice it generated was, within the regulatory framework, correct. It was also going to end 53 years of Halverson milk. Nora called her father that morning after the first milking. Clarence was 84 years old and still lived in the farmhouse he had built in 1964, 200 yards down the road from the dairy. He listened without speaking until she finished. Then he said, "What does the floor crack look like?" She said it ran about 4 feet along the east drain. He said he had been watching that crack since 2011 and had always meant to epoxy it. She said she knew. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Clarence said, "What are you going to do?" She did not answer that question for 3 weeks. What she did in those 3 weeks was the following. She had a concrete contractor assess the floor repair, which came in at $4,800. She had an electrician quote the lighting fixture replacement, which came in at $200. She had a refrigeration technician look at the compressor, which required a replacement part available in 8 to 12 weeks. The cooling rate deficiency alone, the compressor, would take longer to resolve than the 30-day notice window allowed. She called the USDA regional office in Madison and asked about an extension. A compliance specialist told her that extensions were available in cases of demonstrated financial hardship and ongoing remediation effort, and that she should submit a remediation plan within 15 days. She submitted the remediation plan. She documented the repair quotes, the compressor service timeline, and her 22-year record of Grade A compliance with no prior violations. The extension request was denied. The compliance specialist, when she called to ask why, said the cooling rate deficiency was a food safety issue that did not permit extended non-compliance timelines regardless of remediation effort. He said this in the tone of a person reading from a policy document, which is what he was doing. Then he said something else. He said the agency's records showed that the 7 CFR Part 58 standards had been publicly available to producers since 1978, and that a 22-year compliant operation should have been well aware of the cooling rate requirement without needing it explained. He said this with 2 other people in the room. She could hear them on the call. He said it the way someone says something they believe is simply accurate, not understanding that accuracy delivered without regard for what it costs is its own kind of cruelty. She thanked him and hung up the phone. Nora thanked him. She hung up the phone. She went outside and stood in the doorway of the barn for a long time, looking at the 64 cows in their stanchions, listening to the sound a dairy barn makes in the middle of the day when nothing is happening. The low collective breath of animals that do not know that anything has changed. She called an attorney in Eau Claire named David Holt, who had handled agricultural matters in the western Wisconsin counties for 26 years. Holt reviewed the notice and the remediation plan and the denial. He said the denial was procedurally defensible under the regulations as written, and that a legal challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed within the 30-day window. He said she had 2 realistic options: complete all repairs inside 30 days and request a reinspection, or cease marketing fluid milk and pivot. She said she understood. She thanked him. She said she would be in touch. She was not in touch with Holt again for 19 months. What she did instead began in the cellar. The cellar beneath the Halverson farmhouse was not a modern basement. It was a poured concrete room, 24 feet by 18 feet, with a ceiling height of 7 feet at the center that sloped to 5 feet along the north and south walls. Built by Clarence Halverson in 1971 when he poured the addition onto the back of the original house. It had been used, in its lifetime, as a root vegetable storage, a canning room, a place to keep the chest freezer and the spare tractor parts and the 4 filing boxes of farm records going back to 1961. It had a single south-facing window, 24 inches by 18 inches, that let in light for approximately 4 hours a day in summer. It was 56 degrees in January and 61 degrees in July. It was, Nora understood on the afternoon she walked down the stairs and stood in the middle of it for a long time, a controlled temperature environment. Her father had mentioned caves. He had mentioned them twice, years apart, in the way that Clarence Halverson mentioned things he had read about and found interesting, but had never acted on. Cheese caves. The practice of aging wheels of hard cheese in natural or constructed underground environments where the temperature and humidity stayed stable enough to support the rind formation and microbial activity that a properly aged cheese required. He had mentioned a farm in Vermont he had read about in a dairy magazine. He had mentioned it the way he mentioned a lot of things, as information offered to whoever was listening without pressure or expectation. Nora had listened. She had a herd of 64 cows that could not sell fluid milk under federal order. She had 220 acres. She had a cellar. She had 11 years of understanding what her milk was. The fat content, the protein ratios, the seasonal variation, the flavor profile that came from pasture-forward summer grazing on Dunn County grass. And she had, in the month following the shutdown notice, read everything she could find about farmstead cheesemaking. The Wisconsin Department of Agriculture licensing requirements for an artisan cheese facility, the processing equipment required for a plant permitted to handle fewer than 500,000 pounds of milk per year, the aging requirements for the specific styles of cheese she was interested in making, and the wholesale and direct market price points for aged farmstead cheddar in the upper Midwest in 2014. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were not impossible. She applied for a Wisconsin Grade B milk producer's license, which allowed her to market milk for manufacturing purposes rather than fluid consumption and required a less extensive compliance standard than Grade A. The application was approved in 6 weeks. She contacted a licensed cheesemaker in Clark County named Ruth Oberg, who had been making farmstead cheese for 14 years and who agreed, for a consulting fee of $800, to spend 3 weekends at the Halverson farm teaching Nora the basic make procedures for a pressed, aged cheddar-style cheese and walking her through the Wisconsin licensing requirements for an on-farm cheese plant. Nora poured a new concrete slab in the cellar in August of 2014. She installed pine shelving along 3 walls, 11 boards, each 14 inches wide, running floor to ceiling, spaced 18 inches apart to allow air circulation. She ordered a used commercial vat pasteurizer, a 60-gallon jacketed kettle, and a hydraulic press from a dairy equipment dealer in Minnesota. She plumbed the pasteurizer into the existing water lines in the cellar stairwell. She wired a dehumidistat to a small exhaust fan in the south window to manage humidity. The total equipment cost, including installation and licensing fees, was $23,400. She paid it from savings and from the proceeds of selling 12 cows she could not feed through a winter without the milk income to support the herd costs. She made her first 40-pound wheel of cheese in October of 2014. She made it alone, starting at 4 in the morning, following Ruth Oberg's handwritten procedure notes, step by step. It took 11 hours from the first milk pull to the press. She pressed it for 18 hours under 50 pounds of weight, checked it twice, and moved it to the cellar shelf at 6 in the evening when the barn chores were done. She rubbed the rind with lard, beef tallow, the way Oberg had shown her, and wrote the date on a strip of masking tape and pressed it to the side. Then she went upstairs and ate dinner and went to bed. She turned it every morning for the next 6 months. It was not a good wheel. The texture was open in the center where the curd had knit unevenly during the cheddaring step, and the rind had developed a blue-gray mold patch on the north face that Ruth Oberg, when Nora sent her a photograph, said was harmless but indicated that the humidity was running 3 to 5 points too high during the first aging month. Nora adjusted the dehumidistat. She made a second wheel in November, a third in December. By the third wheel, she understood, in the way you understand a physical process only after you have done it badly twice, what the curd was supposed to feel like when the cheddaring was right, firm without being brittle, giving slightly under pressure, holding its structure through the mill. She knew it was right the third time because she knew what wrong had felt like the first 2. By March of 2015, she had 11 wheels aging on the Cellar shelves. She sold the first 6 to a specialty food retailer in Hudson, Wisconsin, in April of 2015 at $18 per pound for a 40-pound wheel, $720 per wheel for a 300 for the 6. The retailer called her 2 weeks later and asked if she had more. She did not have more yet. She would in August. Clarence came down the cellar stairs the first time in June of 2015. He was 82 years old and the stairs were steep, and Nora stood behind him in case he needed it. He stood at the bottom and looked at the shelves. He counted the wheels without saying anything. There were 17 of them at that point, at various stages of aging, wrapped in cloth and rubbed and turned and dated in Nora's handwriting on a strip of masking tape on each rind. He said, "How much does one of those weigh?" She said 40 pounds. He stood there for a moment longer. He was looking at the shelves the way he looked at things he was calculating, not admiring exactly, but measuring. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." That was all he said. He went back upstairs. By the end of 2016, Halverson Farmstead Cheese was licensed, operational, and producing 280 pounds of aged cheddar per month from a reduced herd of 48 cows. 16 fewer than at peak, because the manufacturing milk volumes she needed were lower than the fluid milk volumes the dairy had required. And a smaller, better managed herd suited the operation more precisely. Her wholesale accounts included 4 specialty retailers in the Twin Cities metro, 2 in Eau Claire, and 1 restaurant group in Minneapolis that had put her aged cheddar on a cheese board that appeared on their menu with the farm's name and county of origin. The retail price at Farm Direct Sales, which she ran twice a month from the end of the driveway, was $22 per pound. In 2017, Halverson Farmstead Cheese grossed $118,000. In 2018, it grossed $147,000. The Halverson Dairy, at its peak operation in 2013, had grossed $61,200 in milk receipts. The USDA meeting was held on a Thursday morning in February of 2019 in a conference room at the USDA Service Center in Menomonee, a government building room with a drop ceiling and fluorescent lighting and a folding table with 4 chairs and a window overlooking the parking lot. Nora drove herself. She wore her good coat. She carried a folder. The meeting had been requested by the USDA's regional dairy specialist, a woman named Patricia Gould, who was 48 years old and had spent 19 years in agricultural compliance work in western Wisconsin. Gould was not unfriendly. She had requested the meeting because she had become aware, through the specialty food community in the region, that the Halverson operation was producing and selling cheese under a Wisconsin plant license. And she had questions about the Grade B manufacturing milk pathway, and whether the current licensing structure adequately covered the on-farm processing activities. Nora had anticipated the questions. She had brought the Grade B producer license, the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture cheese plant license, the facility inspection records from the state dairy inspector who had visited the Cellar operation 3 times in the prior 2 years, and the DATCP compliance certificates from each inspection. Everything was current. Everything was clean. There was nothing to discuss. Gould looked through the documents. She asked 2 questions, both administrative, both answered by the paperwork in front of her. Then she looked up. She asked how the operation was going. Nora said it was going well. She said the 2018 gross had been $147,000 and she expected 2019 to come in higher. Gould looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the documents. She said everything appeared to be in order. Nora thanked her. She drove home. She did not stop to think about the meeting for long, because there was a 48-pound wheel that needed turning and a vat to clean and a retail Saturday coming in 4 days that she needed to prepare for. The cellar was waiting. The herd was waiting. There was work to do. David Holt called her that afternoon. He had heard about the meeting from a colleague and wanted to make sure everything had gone smoothly. She told him it had. He asked how the business was doing. She told him the 2018 figure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, the dairy was doing $61,000 when they shut it down." She said she knew. He said, "They shut down a $61,000 operation. And you built a $147,000 one out of the basement." She said, "Cellar." He said, "Right." She thanked him and told him she had to go. On Saturday morning, she was at the end of the driveway at 8 a.m., with a folding table and 14 wheels at various ages and a handwritten sign that said, "Halverson Farmstead, Aged Cheddar, Dunn County, Wisconsin." Her daughter, Claire, who was 29 years old and had driven up from Madison the night before, was beside her, cutting samples on a wooden board. They sold out by 11:15. After the last customer left, they loaded the table into the truck. Claire carried the sign. They walked back up the driveway together without talking. Past the barn, past the equipment shed, past the side door of the farmhouse where the cellar stairs went down. They walked to the far fence line, the north end of the property, where you could see the whole farm from one place. The house, the barn, the pastures running east, the gravel road disappearing south through the trees. They stood there for a while. The February air was cold and still. Claire said, "Grandpa would have been insufferable about this." Nora said, "He would have been taking all the credit." They stood there a little longer. Then they walked back. She was not the only one. In the 3 years following the USDA's 2014 compliance crackdown on small grade A dairies in western Wisconsin, 23 other farm families in Dunn, Chippewa, and Clark counties received notices similar to the one Nora Halverson had read at her kitchen table on that April morning. Some of them sold their herds. Some of them completed the repairs and returned to fluid milk marketing. Some of them did something else entirely. What 2 of those families built, one in Chippewa County and one in Clark County, within 40 miles of the Halverson farm, changed the regional specialty food economy in ways no compliance office predicted. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Their stories are next.